Welcome to Censored, and this reading is from Censored number 114, and it's called Selfishness as a Virtue Revisited, and it's by William J. Eisenman, Ph.D. And at the beginning of the article, there are a couple of quotes which we like to use from time to time, and the first one is "Prove all things, hold fast that which is good," and that comes from 1 Thessalonians 5:21. The second quote is, "He that oppresses the poor to increase his riches, and he that gives to the rich shall surely come to want." Proverbs 22, verse 16. We have in the United States a political party that makes no pretense about favoring the wealthy and powerful over the middle class and the poor, the engines of productivity and true wealth. The conservative moral market philosophy of this political party claims that life is not fair and the world owes none of us a living. Yet we somehow are supposed to owe big corporations tax breaks and subsidies for sending our jobs and manufacturing base overseas. The fact is, it is our present political setup and warped economic traditions that are not fair. We have allowed this unfairness to grow year after year, which has allowed a small cabal of the wealthy and powerful, along with huge corporations, to dominate and run the United States government. For thousands of years, certain people have protected their place in the economy and society with the rule of divine right of kings to rule. This allowed for the creation of an artificial hierarchy of humans. Those high up in this hierarchy took unto themselves power and privilege. These people were the rich, famous, and powerful. These elites were kept in power by armies of the poor, not so famous, and not so powerful. Intelligence played no part in this artificial setup of society. In time, these elites learned a respect for education and hired tutors and teachers for their sons. Eventually, schools were built, and these elites continued to monopolize education. The masses were not educable. It soon became necessary for the elites to find a way to keep the masses in check. A moral code was needed. Ayn Rand wrote that man needs a moral code. What soon developed were two moral codes, one for the elites and one for the masses. The moral code of the elites was one of self-interest, while the moral code of the masses was one of self-sacrifice, altruism, and satisfaction of the irrational desires of others. Ayn Rand saw morality as a contest of whims, much as conservative Republicans see politics today. There was no freedom of choice for the masses in all of this. What are morality and ethics? Ayn Rand, a darling of conservatives, described morality as a code of values to guide our choices and actions. These determine the purpose and course of our lives. According to Ayn Rand, only the concept of life makes the concept of value possible. Only the living regards things as being good or evil. It is only the living that have goals or originate them. Living organisms only can initiate self-generated, goal-directed action. According to Ayn Rand, survival is our standard of value. That which threatens our life is bad, and that which nurtures our life is good. This is the foundation philosophy which allows today's conservative to embrace selfishness as a virtue. Any attack on selfishness is seen as an attack on self-esteem. Ayn Rand sees life as an end in itself. Pleasure is good and pain is bad. Pleasure means we are doing something right, and pain means we are doing something wrong. Our sensations are an automatic form of knowledge. Humans have the capacity to retain sensations. To Ayn Rand, humans have no automatic code of survival, no automatic set of values. Our consciousness is volitional. The ability to think is not an automatic function. When we think, we focus our awareness. An unfocused mind is not conscious. And we survive because of our consciousness. We reason. We are not free to succeed by wrong choices. Ayn Rand wrote of three values: reason, purpose, and self-esteem. She also proposed three virtues: rationality, productiveness, and pride. Conservatives claim they have convictions. They won't sacrifice their convictions to the opinions or wishes of others. This is thought to be the cornerstone of conservative philosophy. This is an attitude that prevents growth, especially when one's convictions find no place in reality. Then change, evolution, or repentance are not options. Convictions that cannot be proved prevent conversion. This requires a faking of reality, an unworkable ideology. Rush Limbaugh said he does not have compassion for the poor, and yet he claims to be a Christian. This is impossible. This is not honesty. Compassion means one has sympathy and sorrow for the plight of another, but it also means one has the desire to alleviate the suffering of the other. Conservatives lack this desire to help. The Bible, which counterfeit Christians like Rush Limbaugh claim they obey, says not our good, but others. Because of wrong-headed conservative convictions, the poverty rate in America is higher than in other industrial democracies. Poverty in America grew more rapidly during the 1980s and 90s. In 1970, there were 4.3 million people receiving food stamps. And in 1990, it was 21.1 million. Today, it's out of sight. The cost of welfare in 1960 was $28.9 billion, while in 1980 it was $159.3 billion. And in 1990, it was $211.9 billion. Our GDP has tripled since 1960. Conservatives regard these increases as failures of liberalism, but in fact, they are failures of penny-wise and pound-foolish governmental and big business policies. These people don't want people on welfare to succeed, to get rich. People who live paycheck to paycheck can never become successful or rich. Conservatives and Ayn Rand share the concept of selfishness as a virtue. But conservatives part company with Ayn Rand when she demands that mysticism and the supernatural be rejected as sources of knowledge. Conservatives claim to get their convictions, their values, and morals from God, the God of the Bible. They don't boast about it, but conservatives agree with Ayn Rand that our highest moral purpose is the achievement of our own happiness. They only pay lip service to the adage that we are here to serve others. Free market loving conservatives come right out and say that happiness is the successful state of life. Suffering is a sign of failure, and we are responsible for our fate. We are not to desire the unearned, and our only rational principle should be trade. We should not expect pay for anything but our achievements. How does this square with tax breaks and subsidies for multinational corporations? Conservatives believe that only a rationally selfish person, a person with self-esteem, could be capable of love. To love is to value. If one does not value himself, how can he value another? This principle makes a mockery of altruism. Behind all the conservative populist rhetoric lies simple self-interest. Michael Lind states that the conservative movement uses imitation populist rhetoric in the service of the rich and the business elite. The poor are blamed for their plight. Those on Social Security are called lesser people. The unemployed are called lazy, and those who are working should be satisfied with minimum wage. Conservatives want us to believe that we are an upwardly mobile society. According to conservatives, we can all become rich. The conservative takes no notice of fate, destiny, timing, milieu, or opportunity. Conservatives believe, as does Phil Gramm, that we are the only nation in the world where our poor are fat. Conservatives are good at convincing those that don't have and never will have that they can get if they just work hard. The onus is always on the individual. Today, Thomas Paine would not get Common Sense published. Ayn Rand and conservatives regard a society that is based on altruism as bad. There is also the belief that government's sole moral purpose is to protect citizens' rights, but in practice, it is the rights of business and the elites of society that are protected by our government. Conservatives trample on individual rights every chance they get. The Bush 2 years are an example. No matter how much lip service those in power pay to individualism, they are not talking about the little guy. To those in power, as he was to Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan, the little guy is a commodity with few rights. Conservatives regard humans as sacrificial animals under altruism. Altruists are considered anti-life. The altruist is said to lack self-esteem. This argument sounds somewhat like the one conservatives use against the poor. The poor are said to lack morality, self-esteem, and a work ethic. It is claimed that the poor would succeed if they just pulled themselves up by the bootstraps and worked hard. This bootstrap and work hard philosophy is said to come from the conservatives' religion. And all would be well if we just had faith. On faith, too, conservatives part. part company with Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand wrote that faith was the equation of feelings with knowledge. Yet conservatives would say they despise feelings as decision-making tools. This is one of those conservative contradictions. In decision-making, if one man can call it that, conservatives rely on ideology and faith. Reason is rejected out of hand. Conservatives do not comprehend that if we commit our consciousness to beliefs that have no sensory evidence or rational proof that are not real, then we are relying on blind faith. Conservative ideology and faith are based on metaphysics. To conservatives, faith is a shortcut to knowledge, most times the wrong knowledge. Today's conservative refuses to be bound by reality. In this way, the conservative comes up with awkward explanations of reality, such as love is an expression and assertion of self-esteem, a response to one's own values in the lover. Also, one's concern for the welfare of those he loves becomes a rational part of one's selfish interest. And only under emergency conditions should one volunteer to help strangers, if it's in one's power. Conservatives are mean-spirited and at times very cruel. Their disdain for the poor is appalling, and their love of the rich is sickening. The conservative credo is that the moral purpose of one's life is the achievement of one's own happiness. They wrap their blatant selfishness up in patriotism, free market economics, and populism. If George Washington had been a conservative, he and his men would not have suffered as they did at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and there would be no United States of America. If Washington had been a conservative, he would have said, "To hell with this," and went home to a nice warm fire and an easy chair. By now, it is clear to see that conservatives hold convictions out of context. They preach the letter of the law and forget the spirit. They preach that our government is the most dangerous threat to our lives, but huge corporations can bleed taxpayers dry and treat workers like commodities, dispensable cogs in the machinery of industry. And that's okay. We are all told to bow down to the almighty corporation. Today's perverted form of capitalism is the conservative's religion. Money is his god, and the bank is his church. Conservatives make promises they cannot keep. They promise that tax cuts for the rich will create jobs. It doesn't happen. In fact, tax cuts never pay for themselves. Where are all the jobs that tax cuts were to create during Bush II's illegitimate presidency? Under G.W. Bush, only 1 million jobs were created in his 8 years. No net jobs were created. Conservatives promise balanced budgets when they are out of power, and when in power, clamor that deficits do not matter. Does anybody remember Dick Cheney? Thus, no Republican in recent memory has ever presided over a surplus. Conservatives believe that all would be well if we just returned prayer to school and women would cease having abortions. These goals are at times contradictory. Social conservatives are represented by the religious right, who have no respect for law or tolerance. They want their agenda fulfilled no matter what. Fiscal conservatives are interested in tax cuts and balanced budgets, along with small and weak government that will be no match for rogue corporations like Enron and Wall Street caused financial meltdowns. The fiscal conservative still has not found a way to mask his greed and selfishness. No matter how it is spun, the balanced budgets and tax cuts of conservatives still work out to be based on greed. They have turned economic theory on its head by favoring the rich, the non-producers of wealth, over the worker, the real producer of wealth. Abraham Lincoln said it clearly that labor is before capital. If selfishness is a virtue, then we have not evolved at all. Every king, pharaoh, and potentate in the past has practiced selfishness as a virtue. Nathaniel Branden wrote that our emotional mechanism works according to the kind of values we choose. If we choose selfishness as a virtue, then how does this help us in our quest to be civilized or part of a community? Obviously, it does not. Selfishness as a virtue pits individual against individual for the commodities and elements of life. Might makes right. It becomes a dog-eat-dog world. Ayn Rand wrote that morality deals with issues open to our choice and that rights are a moral concept. Individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law. Groups have no rights. Only individuals have rights. And the purpose of government is to protect individual rights. However, conservatives do not like people banding together to get their due. Conservatives like to pick them off one by one. We must understand, then, that if we tout selfishness as a virtue, then we will have a society where only the wealthy, powerful, or well-connected will prosper. Selfishness as a virtue is pure propaganda. It is propaganda that was developed to justify greed. The rich, powerful, and well-connected needed a way to put a positive spin on their blatant greed. In the spinning process, the greedy were able to turn the average person's healthy envy and criticism of the rich into a fear and hate of our government. The attack on selfishness has been turned into an attack on self-esteem and the producers of society. There is little real criticism of this propaganda. Critics, liberal and otherwise, have failed to understand that the conservative is defeated when he is deprived of his religious moral high ground. Conservatives claim morals come from God, and those who have not found Jesus are lost. At the base of all their talk of reform, populism, and revolution is this sense of owning the moral high ground. Conservatism cannot be defeated without attacking and undermining this perceived moral high ground, because we are constitutionally tolerant of those who worship gods who cannot be proved to exist. We allow the conservative to lie and deceive. When these lies are believed by wrong-headed people, we end up with bin Ladens and the like. When enough wrong-headed people believe nonsense, they can then have it inscribed in law for you and me. They can prohibit. They can censor. They can practice racism. They can, as they have done in the past, kill you and me. We are born selfish and self-centered, in need. Normally, as we grow and evolve, we learn to care for and need others. The capacity to care for and love others is a natural result of instinctual gratification, according to Wilhelm Reich. In this way, we grow up relatively emotionally unblocked. It is then easy for us to give of ourselves freely and to know love. We outgrow selfishness. Those advocating selfishness as a virtue are stunted in their emotional growth, are emotionally immature. What we learn from this is that selfishness is not a virtue. It's an infantile emotion. Drug dealers are selfish. Wall Streeters are selfish. Muggers are selfish. Rapists are selfish. Dictators are selfish. Those in organized crime are selfish. And according to the Bible, Satan is selfish. Selfishness is not a virtue. It's an indication of an emotionally immature personality. It is a mask that hides a get way of life. This kind of attitude cannot work in communal settings, in marriage, family, society, and civilization. America was built on an anti-selfish sentiment. The Stamp Act was selfish, and early Americans protested it. The British plundering of the American colonies was selfish, and the colonies went to war with Britain to stop it. Much more can be said, but the point is made. There used to be much anti-rich sentiment in America. But a successful conservative propaganda campaign in the last 3 decades has turned greed and selfishness into a virtue. And it's claimed they have religious authority to have done so. These blatant lies and delusions must be unmasked, undermined, countered forcefully, and stopped. It must be made plain that selfishness is not a virtue. It's an emotional problem. The end.